Welcome back everyone. In today's video we're going to be looking at the first two novels in Terry Pratchett's Discworld series, The Colour Magic and The Light Fantastic. The Discworld series is vast, spanning 41 novels all set in the Discworld, a planet-sized flat disc carried through space on the backs of 4 gargantuan elephants, who themselves stand on the shell of the great Atuin, a gigantic turtle. The novels are all standalone, but a number of them are parts of sequences that follow a particular character or characters. In these first two novels, we follow the character of Rincewind, a failed wizard who only knows one spell that has a life of its own and lives in his head. The other storylines follow the witches, the city watch, the personification of death, and many others. You can see a visual overview of how the books relate to one another here. It's definitely worth glossing over this when deciding how to approach the series. Now then, on to my review of The Colour Magic and The Light Fantastic. I'm doing these two together because unlike all the other books in the series, these two are better discussed as one volume, since the events in the second book lead directly on from the events of the first. Part 1. A Hodgepodge of Hilarity. Terry Pratchett described The Colour Magic as an attempt to do for the classical fantasy universe what Blazing Saddles did for Western. For those of you that have seen Blazing Saddles, if you've seen that film and you've read these books, you'll know exactly what he's talking about here. Blazing Saddles is a comedy, parody of old Western films, and The Colour Magic and The Light Fantastic are comedies and parodies of the classical fantasy genre. You've got the character of Rincewind himself, who is a subversion or even a mick-take out of the, the wise wizard character that you get in classic fantasy like Gandalf. But unlike the wise wizard, you've got Rincewind, who is this grumpy, misanthropic wizard who was kicked out of university and is not particularly wise at all. You also have other nods to other classic fantasy series. For instance, there's the character of Conan the Barbarian, who is a rip-off of Conan the Barbarian. And you've also got some nods to Greek literature, like the Odyssey and the Iliad, and all kinds of things. There's just pretty much every classical fantasy trope and aspect of classic mythology you can think of is mentioned or referenced here. Pratchett also uses these novels to a lesser extent to commentate on real-world issues. One of the characters in the novel, one of the main characters, is Twoflower, who is branded as the Discworld's first tourist. And you can see in his character lots of winks and nods to tourism and the ways in which tourists go to other countries and how they interact with the people there. And it's really funny to see that. He does it really well. And likewise with the classical fantasy tropes, there's a lot there to laugh at and to enjoy. If you're familiar with classical fantasy, then this is definitely a book that you'll be able to enjoy, because you'll be able to pick up on all of those various references, and there are a lot of them throughout the novel. In fact, we could talk pretty much all day about the various references in these two books, but unfortunately we're going to have to talk about the rest of the book, and unfortunately the other aspects of the book aren't all that great. But what I will say to round this section off is that the books, both of them, are pretty funny, they're enjoyable to read, and while some of the jokes don't quite land, or they might require knowledge of fantasy, classical fantasy, for the most part it works, at least in terms of humour and parodying classical fantasy. Part 2. Plot? What plot? So one of the big problems that I had, especially with The Colour Magic, less so with The Light Fantastic, was the lack of plot in the books. The books are pretty much, kind of as I described with the title of the last part of this video, a hodgepodge of jokes and events that are just kind of strung together, and this can be fine, but it made it very difficult for me to actually follow the story. It didn't really feel like there was anything, especially in The Colour Magic, holding the narrative together. It was just a series of random events, seemingly barely related to one another. It was just, this happens, and then this crazy thing happens, and it was really hard to actually follow the story and, be invested in it. Now, it can be fine to have a book that doesn't have a plot. There are plenty of plotless books that are really, really great, but there really wasn't all that much substance to the book, aside from cracking jokes, at least in my view. It definitely felt as though while reading this that Terry Pratchett is still finding his feet when it comes to writing a novel, putting a novel together, and making the overall narrative fit. This did improve with the second book, The Light Fantastic. I was able to follow what was going on in that book a lot more. With The Colour Magic, I had to reread several passages because the way that he was describing things was just very quick and very unclear. So a lot of the time I just didn't really know what was happening. Whereas in The Light Fantastic, I felt like he's already improving his writing skills, he's already improving his plotting skills to make a much more cohesive and easier to follow narrative. So yeah, if you like plot-based novels, then you may struggle with these two books. Also, like I said, even though it isn't necessarily a bad thing to not have a plot, I think you do need something else, and there really wasn't anything else there that really invested me in the books overall. Part 3. Cardboard characters. So, these books are somewhat parodies, right? And if you're going to parody classical fantasy tropes, then your characters, if they're parodying some aspect of classical fantasy, might have to be a little bit of a stereotype, or at least a bit exaggerated. Now that's fine, but they still need to be interesting characters, and we still want to enjoy following them. If you compare the character of Rincewind or Twoflower with characters in the later Discworld books, like the personification of Death or Granny Weatherwax, those characters are still somewhat exaggerated, but they're really enjoyable to follow, and I really enjoyed their stories. I didn't really care about Rincewind, I didn't really care about Twoflower. The characterization of these two just felt incredibly flat, not really fleshed out at all, and they didn't really change that much throughout the two novels. This is a big problem because they're the main characters that we follow, and I just didn't find myself invested in these characters. Also, because the novel didn't have much of a plot. Usually if a novel doesn't have a plot, you want good characters because then it's the characters that will carry the book. But in this case, neither the characters or the plot really carried much of anything. Again, this is something that I did think improved in the light fantastic. I still wasn't that bothered about Rincewind or Twoflower, but there were a couple of background characters that I did enjoy following. I thought the parody of Conan the Barbarian, was really funny, and I also thought the evil villain of the second book, Trimon, who's like a politicking wizard character, was also really enjoyable and interesting. Outside of those though, I really didn't care much for any of the characters, especially in that first book where there was pretty much no one that I was invested in at all. Part 4. It gets better with age. So I am being quite negative when it comes to these first two books, but don't let that discourage you from reading other Discworld books. In fact, Terry Pratchett himself even says to new readers of the series that they should begin with some of the later novels because he thinks they're a much better introduction, much better written, because by that point he's, honed his craft and he's capable of writing a decent plot and interesting characters, as well as still being very funny and amusing. I actually started the series myself with Equal Rights and Mort, which is a witch book and a death book, and I really enjoyed those books, and I'm looking forward to carrying on the storylines of those characters. In terms of the Rincewind novels, I don't think I'm going to be carrying on with that storyline for a while. I'm definitely going to be carrying on with the other ones, and probably come back to this at some later time. If any of you have read some of the later Rincewind novels though, please let me know in the comments what you think of them, how they compare with the other storylines, and whether they're worth carrying on with. What I would recommend when approaching the Discworld series is looking at the sheet that I put in the video earlier where it shows you the various storylines. Have a look at that, see which ones look interesting to you, which characters stand out, which ones do you want to follow, and just follow one of those narratives. It really doesn't matter which one you go with, so long as you go with the linear time order. You're not going to have things spoiled for you because a lot of the novels are standalone and disconnected, so you can pretty much begin with any storyline that you choose. It probably isn't a good idea to start with these two books, because that might put you off reading some really, really great fantasy books later on in the series. So definitely don't begin here, and begin somewhere else with some of the better books. Conclusion. Overall, the main attractions of the Colour Magic and the Light Fantastic are their humour. They're both a pair of funny romps that just poke fun and play around with classical fantasy, and on that front they're both pretty solid to decent. I would say that the second book is better in terms of its humour, in terms of its plot and its characters, and I would say that I actually found that okay. I actually quite liked, or somewhat liked, the second book, whereas I didn't really find the Colour Magic that enjoyable at all, and I probably wouldn't read it again. It's probably not the best place to start in the series. Pick somewhere else, please pick somewhere else, and go from there. I think you'll definitely find it more rewarding to begin with those later books, and you definitely won't be put off. You'll be drawn back, and then, somewhere down the line you can come and look at these two early novels and just see how different Terry Pratchett's writing style was when he began, and how much he improves over time. Okay, that's it for today's video. Please like and subscribe for more content, and comment down below what are your thoughts on the Discworld series, and in particular, what are your thoughts on these first two novels? Do you think that they're a bit underrated, or do you, like me, think that they're okay but not really fantastic pieces of fantasy? Thanks for watching, and I'll see you all in the next video.